The chief village stands on the pleasant high ground nearly midway between the sea and the harbor, on the one side to Nahant and Marblehead and over the open ocean, and on the other to the fortified islands and the blue hills of Milton. It is a pretty New England hamlet, without a touch of suburbanism, and as rural and simple as if it were inwalled by the distant hills of Berkshire or Aroostook. M.F. Sweetser, King's Handbook of Boston Harbor, 1882.
Winthrop is pretty nearly a unique place. And as for the truth, well, talk 5 minutes to any resident of Winthrop and you'll be convinced. For the people of Winthrop are enthusiastic about at least one thing at any rate, and that is their hometown. When they talk about Winthrop, they simply state the facts without exaggeration or hyperbole, and then invite one to come and see. They know that seeing is believing. Ernest H. Gruning, Boston American, 1912.
Curling out into Boston Harbor, this seaside town is a relatively quiet place, despite the occasional roar of jet engines overhead. Though it borders East Boston and Revere, Winthrop seems somehow farther removed than the map implies.
Chris Keneally, Boston Globe, 1988.
Winthrop by the sea. Less than 2 square miles, population about 19,000. Unlike any other suburb bordering on Boston, Winthrop has retained the feel of a small town, having been spared the urban blight of many neighboring cities, and has remained comfortably middle class. Despite the well-publicized pollution problems of Boston Harbor and the occasional destructive power of storms roaring in from the Atlantic, the ocean has acted as a magnet to generations of Winthropites and has played a large part in the livelihoods of many. For the other factors that define Winthrop, one must reach back to the earliest recorded history, centuries before Winthrop became a town. There is sketchy evidence that Vikings visited Boston Harbor, and possibly Winthrop, around the year 1000. And for centuries, long before permanent European settlements, fishermen from England, France, and Portugal visited New England shores to fish and trade with the Indians. In 1605, the French explorer Saudemont anchored off the Winthrop shore near Noddle's Island, today's East Boston. He estimated that Boston was the center of an Indian nation of between 150 and 200,000 people. Intimidated in the face of these numbers, de Man left Boston Harbor and settled instead in Acadia. Soon after, a pestilence, probably caught from a European fisherman or trader, spread through the Indian villages in the Boston area. This epidemic, combined with a war with the Tarantine tribe from Maine, left the local Indians decimated. The first European settlers to stay permanently were the Pilgrims and Puritans in the early 17th century. They found a pristine and varied land.
So pleasant a scene here they had, as did much refresh them, and there came a smell off the shore like the smell of a garden. Letter from an anonymous Puritan.
In that day, the outer rocks, islets, and sandy wastes were the nurseries of countless wildfowl and a multitude of species. Among those, the great auk, now deemed extinct, nested with gannet, cormorant, puffin, and gulls, and terns of many species. Harp, hood, and harbor seals of all kinds basked on the rocks and ledges, and now and then a walrus or two strayed from among the southern herd at Sable Island and bared great, grim tusks among the gentler creatures of these waters. Charles W. Hall, Historic Winthrop, 1902.
Winnisimmett was the name the Indians used for a much larger area that included Winthrop. The European settlers developed their own names: Rumney Marsh for today's Revere, Pullen Pointe for Winthrop. William Wood, in his 1634 book, New England's Prospect, described the necessity of boaters at certain times to pull their vessels through the strait separating what is today Point Shirley from Deer Island. This led to the name Pulling, or Pullen Point. The strait, later known as Shirley Gut, was filled in the 1940s. Deer Island, although it has never actually belonged to Winthrop, has had a great impact on the area. It has been home to an almshouse, an immigrant quarantine station, the Suffolk County House of Correction, and a sewage treatment plant, among other things. During the widespread Indian uprising known as King Philip's War, several hundred friendly Indians were crowded into what was, in effect, a concentration camp on the island. They were left with no food in the middle of winter.
No sadder scene has New England ever witnessed than Deer Island in 1675 to 76, when, during the panic caused by King Philip's War, Massachusetts tore the Christian Indians from their inland villages and confined them upon this bleak and dreary strand. The penalty of death was enacted against any who should leave this gloomy prison. Very many died and were sadly buried by the moaning and misty sea. M.F. Sweetser, King's Handbook of Boston Harbor.
As Boston flourished as the center of Puritan New England, Pointe, then part of Boston, remained virtually uninhabited. The first European residents of today's Winthrop were William Cheeseborough and an Irish indentured servant who served as cattle, goat, and sheep herders for Boston residents who had run out of room for their livestock in the city. Their dwelling was likely near the freshwater pond close to today's E.B. Newton School, an area with plenty of water and grass for the cattle. The pond has since been filled in. Pointe's land had no private ownership until 1636, when a committee divided Rumney Marsh and Pointe. These land grants were commonly called the Great Allotments. Governor John Winthrop received the largest of these allotments, a total of 120 acres. His house was on the southern side of Great Head, at the site of today's Governor Winthrop Motel. Governor Winthrop spent little time at this house, living mainly in Boston. This was typical of Winthrop's first landowners. Most of them lived in Boston, while indentured servants and slaves managed and worked their Winthrop farms. Although on a smaller scale than their southern counterparts, these farms were among the first slave plantations of the colonial era. In 1647, Dean Winthrop inherited all of his father's land at Pointe. He also purchased the Pierce estate from the captain's widow after Pierce was killed by the Spanish in the West Indies. Dean Winthrop then owned the entire beach area, along with the areas we know today as Point Shirley, Cottage Hill, and the Highlands. Dean Winthrop and his family moved into the house Pierce had built, and there they spent many quiet years. The house was acquired by the Winthrop Improvement and Historical Association in 1906 and is today one of the oldest houses in New England. About a third of the original Pointe landowners were part of the group of Bostonians banished to Rhode Island along with Anne Hutchinson, who had questioned some of the religious beliefs of the Puritan leaders. This opened the door for James Bill, a wealthy businessman, to acquire much of Pointe's land. By 1671, virtually all of Pointe not owned by Dean Winthrop was owned by James Bill. Upon Bill's death, his three sons divided the land among themselves. Jonathan Bill's house stood on Beale Street until the 1930s. The Bill family married into the Belcher, Tewksbury, and Floyd families. These names would figure prominently in the town's affairs for many years. The Bill family name died out in the area, but by 1840, 142 of the 156 people in Pointe would be descendants of James Bill. Through much of the 1700s, business in Pointe still consisted chiefly of a few sheep farms, along with clam digging and the harvesting of kelp and salt hay, when a leading Boston businessman, Colonel Thomas Goldthwaite, along with several other prominent local men, started a fishery at the part of Pointe then called the Gut Plain in 1753.
On Saturday last, His Excellency Governor Shirley did the proprietors of Pulling Point the honor of dining with them at the said point, where a very elegant entertainment was prepared for him. His Excellency expressed great satisfaction on finding so considerable an addition to that valuable branch of trade, the cod fishery. The proprietors, after having leave from His Excellency, gave it the name of Point Shirley. Boston Newsletter, September 1753.
The name Point Shirley was given to the outermost peninsula of Pointe, stretching from Great Head to Shirley Gut. This visit by the Massachusetts governor spread the fame of Pointe and set the stage for its future as a resort. Pointe at this time was a part of Chelsea, and in 1755 Thomas Goldthwaite became the first selectman to represent Point Shirley in the Chelsea government. The success was short-lived. Business at the fishery fell off during the French and Indian War and never recovered. The business was closed in 1758. The abandoned buildings of the fishery were temporary home to the Acadians banished from Nova Scotia on their journey south in 1762. Then, in 1764, the buildings were used as a smallpox hospital. During the Revolution, 17 men from the sparse population of Pointe served as Minutemen, including Joe Borrow, a free black man. The only battle of consequence off the shores of Pointe was the Battle of Shirley Gut in 1776. In May of 1776, Captain James Mugford was in command of a schooner, the Franklin, when it went aground in Shirley Gut. 13 British vessels bore down on the Franklin, but the Americans fought hard, and after an hour, the British withdrew. Captain Mugford was killed just before the British retreat, the only American casualty compared to over 70 for the British. His last words were, "We have won. Don't give up the vessel." A memorial tablet to Captain Mugford was erected by the Daughters of the American Revolution at the end of Winthrop Shore Drive. A second attempt at an industry at Point Shirley was begun by Russell Sturgis in 1803. The Point Shirley Salt Works, like the fishery before it, was not very successful and closed by about 1830. Winthrop's most successful industry, the Revere Copper Works, moved to Point Shirley from Canton in 1845. The copper works, started by Paul Revere and his son, Joseph Warren Revere, flourished, especially during the Civil War, the only really successful industry in Winthrop's history. The copper works was a mixed blessing, however.
Nothing green would grow in the presence of those noxious exhalations, so poetically described in an 1868 tourist brochure of Nahant, not Winthrop. Over the point often hangs a thick white smoke, which the sun sometimes touches, so that it looks in the distance like a silver veil thrown over the land. Joseph Garland, Boston's North Shore.
The copper works shut down by 1872, taking away jobs, but also the poisonous fumes that were becoming an increasing annoyance. Pieces of slag from the copper works are still commonly found on Point Shirley in the vicinity of the Coughlin Playground. In the early days, the easiest way for Point residents to travel to Boston was by boat. The land route to Boston was a day's journey, 20 miles long, passing through parts of Revere, Everett, Medford, Somerville, Cambridge, and Brookline. The Salem Turnpike, the nation's first major road, was built in 1802. Today's Broadway in Chelsea and Revere follows the route of the Salem Turnpike. The turnpike included a bridge over the Mystic River, which shortened the route to Boston considerably. The bridge across Belle Isle Inlet, connecting Point and East Boston, was built in 1835. A road from the bridge led to the East Boston Ferry into Boston. In addition, a stagecoach from Point Shirley to Maverick Square in East Boston was instituted in 1848. Winthrop was no longer a virtual island, and the town began to grow. The year-round residents of Winthrop in the mid-19th century were still farmers and fishermen, but a sign of things to come was the fact that over 400 Boston residents were summering in Winthrop by 1855. Property values were increasing, and landowners were dividing their farms into smaller house lots. In the late 1840s, Judge Edward Greeley Loring, a Bostonian who frequented the nearby resort town Nahant, and his friend George Emerson, cousin to Ralph Waldo, built cottages in what is now the Court Park section. Judge Loring and Judge John Lowell, another resident of the area, were responsible for the naming of the section Court Park, as well as the naming of Circuit Road. Both names were references to their legal background. George Emerson, first principal of Boston English High School, was responsible for the planting of 1,500 trees along the Winthrop shore.
The planting done here years ago by the author of Trees and Shrubs of Massachusetts was well done. If it be true that whoever plants a tree wins a place in paradise, George B. Emerson's place is surely secured. Albert Winslow Cobb, The Town of Winthrop.
Meanwhile, in 1850, Horace Augustus Taft was molding Taft's Hotel on Point Shirley into one of the most renowned hotels and restaurants in New England.
Taft's Hotel was rapidly assuming a commanding position in hostelries all over the country. We have heard allegedly fantastic tales of the extraordinary menus which Horace Augustus Taft served to the world, but the average person sometimes doubts the veracity of the stories. A prominent East Bostonian made careful notes of what he found at the Point Shirley Mecca. There were 42 dining rooms and halls in the establishment, and Mr. Taft personally showed our visitor 24 varieties of fish and 29 assortments of game. Edward Rose Snow, The Winthrop Review, 1937.
It is well authenticated history that in these rooms, overlooking the sea and the mystical-looking spires and domes of Boston, the famous Atlantic Club used to meet with Oliver Wendell Holmes, James Russell Lowell, Emerson, Longfellow, and other choice spirits at its board. Albert Winslow Cobb.
Chelsea had become a major city by the mid-19th century. Pointe, a part of Chelsea since 1739, was increasingly crowded out of major decisions affecting its citizens. In 1845, Pointe and today's Revere became a new town, North Chelsea. Pointe's residents soon felt underrepresented in the North Chelsea government. There was a growing movement to break away and form a new town. The issue was settled on March 27, 1852. The town of Winthrop was born, named for the Commonwealth's first governor. The first Board of Selectmen and other town officers largely consisted of members of longtime Winthrop families, like the Belchers, Floyds, and Tewksburys. In 1845, the little one-room schoolhouse built in 1805 gave way to a new school built on the same site. In 1856, this school was replaced by a new combined town hall and school at the site of today's police station. Winthrop was growing, but in the mid-19th century, the town still had more in common with rural New England than cosmopolitan Boston.
There were many customs of old times which persisted into mid-century days. One was the Election Day shoot. On Election Day, many Winthrop men took their shotguns and killed as many birds as they could possibly find. When the day ended, the weary Winthrop hunters trudged home with their bags of birds, and their wives served them as a special Election Day pie with supper. This was, of course, before the days of the Audubon Society. William Clark, The History of Winthrop, 1952.
72 Winthrop men served in the Civil War, including Brigadier General William Francis Bartlett. After the war, Governor Andrew visited Winthrop's town hall and presented a sword to Bartlett, calling him Massachusetts' most valuable soldier. Field artillery was tested during the war, fired from near today's Cutler Street towards Grover's Cliff. Over the years, many Civil War-era cannonballs have been found near the cliff. After years of various forms of horse-drawn transportation into Winthrop, work began in 1876 on a branch of the Boston, Revere Beach, and Lynn Railroad, sometimes called the Wiggler. The new branch was named the Boston, Winthrop, and Point Shirley Railroad, commonly known as the narrow gauge or peanut train. Winthrop also had a broad gauge railroad, which prospered for a time in the 1880s. The narrow gauge, however, had a far greater impact. Each year the railroad pushed further into the town, looping around Great Head and reaching Point Shirley in 1888, stopping at 9 stations in all. In April 1888, workmen excavating for the new Winthrop Center station found Indian remains and artifacts. The site was photographed for Harvard University by young local resident Harry Worf.
Judging from the artifacts unearthed, it seems probable that the period is very near the beginning of the 17th century. This locality was in the territory of the Massachusetts Indians, and the burial place undoubtedly belongs to that tribe. Charles C. Willoughby, Harvard University, 1924.
Many commuters rode the train to East Boston, then ferries to Boston.
To look back for a moment, probably everybody in Winthrop considered the narrow gauge with affection. It served us all so long and so well. In sad contrast to the present, There were always seats in the Winthrop trains. No one stood. The ride was smooth and adequately rapid, and the ventilation was sufficient. Then, that ride across the harbor was really a delight. On hot afternoons, coming home, particularly the fresh harbor breezes which swept through the ferries from bow to stern, revived the wilted commuters amazingly. William H. Clark, The History of Winthrop.
To me, the edge of the world seemed to run along the railroad tracks, far across the golf course. I watched trains chugging back and forth, trailing great white puffs behind them, the setting sun reflecting gold flashes from their windows. W.E. Merriman, Winthrop Beach Memoirs.
Around the same time that the narrow gauge railroad was being extended into Winthrop, Dr. Samuel Ingalls, former superintendent of the Horse Railroad, took note of what he saw as underuse of Winthrop's beach area.
The only apparent use of the long stretches of beach between the hills was to enforce the mandate of the mighty Jehovah by staying the proud waves of the aggressive ocean and affording the neighboring farmers abundance of kelp and rockweed. Dr. Samuel Ingalls.
In 1875, Dr. Ingalls purchased 43 acres along Winthrop Beach.
Ocean Spray, he christened his investment, and in 1875 commenced to parcel it out at 2 cents a foot, shortly up to 8 cents, insisting upon a no liquor clause in each and every deed, with the admonition that there shall be one sea-girt resort where the fiend of the still shall not hold court. Joseph Garland, Boston's North Shore.
By August 7th, 1875, a cottage had been built every 4 days since the 18th of June, and the people of the section were naming its streets. The next season, 1876, progress was made every week until by fall a fine summer colony had been established. The inhabitants of the Spray section of town decided to invite everyone from the rest of Winthrop to help observe what they called their first anniversary celebration with a monstrous clam bake. Edward Rose Snow, The Winthrop Review.
The attractive residence of Dr. Samuel Ingalls crowns one of the high places of our picturesque town. Its occupant, if not the monarch of all, is of much he surveys, looking down upon goodly acres of hill and vale. Beachmont and Winthrop Visitor, 1883.
Just across the water, you can almost shake hands with Nahant, while your eye catches the smoke of the moving palaces, the white wings of the floating argosies of the bay, and the spray that glitters in the sunshine over the Brewsters and the Graves. Dr. Samuel Ingalls, East Boston Advocate, 1877.
One of the most attractive summer villages on the Massachusetts coast is this prettily named district of Ocean Spray in the town of Winthrop, with its beach gently curving between 2 high cliffs, the bright, wide sea in front, and the level salt marshes behind. The surf is usually light, and bathing is quite safe, but during easterly and northerly gales, there is a tremendous pounding along the entire line. There are now several scores of cottages at Ocean Spray, mostly of a more attractive order of architecture than is usually found in beach houses, and in some cases they are spacious and substantial villas occupied throughout most of the year. The local summer society is peculiarly homogeneous and mildly evangelical, with every evening devoted to some form of associated pleasure, musicales, square dances, or chapel going, and ending early, so that by 10 o'clock nearly all the house lamps are out, and the resonant music of the low surf breaking on the beach is almost the only sound that is heard. M.F. Sweetser.
A clam bake at Ocean Spray in 1878 drew 10,000 people from all over the area, the largest group assembled in Winthrop up to that time. The beach property adjacent to Ocean Spray, excluding the Elijah Cutler estate, was owned by Captain J.W. Tewksbury. It was divided into cottage lots under the name Atlantic Wave. The Atlantic Wave development, while successful, never received the widespread fame that Ocean Spray did. Dr. Ingalls of Ocean Spray was a master promotion, giving his streets attractive names like Mermaid, Dolphin, and Neptune. Tewksbury named his Atlantic Wave streets more prosaically after people: Irwin, Charles, Tewksbury. The very name Ocean Spray captured the public imagination in a way that Atlantic Wave did not. The Tewksbury family sold their land on Great Head. This area, also called Cottage Hill, followed Ocean Spray and Atlantic Wave in quick development as a resort.
Great Head was purchased by Mr. William B. Rice of Quincy in 1883. It was laid out with house lots and avenues with sodded banks, with carriage drives and sidewalks. The planting of many trees made the ascent a pleasant and easy walk. Where the Tewksbury Gardens once grew, on the sunny hillside and soft-eyed cattle pasture, was now a settlement of villas and permanent homes with gardens and terraces. Maria L. Underhill, A Brief History of Winthrop Beach, 1902.
Suddenly, Winthrop was a prosperous resort. Hotels were springing up all over town. Ford's Hotel on the beach, which was subsequently destroyed by fire, St. Leonard's on Sturgis Street, the Shirley and the Winthrop Beach House at Ocean Spray, the Hotel Winthrop on Cottage Hill, and the most luxurious of all, the Cottage Park Hotel. Ocean Spray and Cottage Hill were alive with music, dancing, and fireworks all summer.
There was a large gathering of guests and their friends at the Shirley Hotel on Wednesday evening for the purpose of taking part in a monster clam bake. An immense fire was built on the beach where the clams were baked. During the process of cooking, the spectators lined the crest and the piazzas of the hotel and witnessed a brilliant display of fireworks. Dancing took place in the casino, which was kept up until a late hour and thoroughly enjoyed by all present. The Beachmont and Winthrop Visitor, July 1882.
An 1882 parade of horse-drawn coaches, each decorated by the guests of the various Winthrop hotels, drew thousands.
The coaching parade is over, and the name of Winthrop is now known all over New England. And in fact, its fame has spread all over the country, for the Sunday papers gave it headlines on their first pages. Crowds of expectant mortals were assembled on the crest. They whiled away their time commenting on the beauties of our beautiful town, and feasted their eyes on the blue Atlantic, sparkling in the summer sun, with here and there a white sail gleaming in the distance. The Winthrop Gazette, 1882.
July 4th, 1882, was long to be remembered by Winthrop people. The Winthrop Baseball Association held its first game against the Chelseas, with a great track meet staged in the morning. After dinner, Winthrop watched its first baseball game. Chelsea won 13-8. The feature was a double play, Allen to Livermore. Fireworks were then enjoyed as the evening wore on. Meanwhile, at Taft's Hotel, the largest crowd on record feasted on the choice viands at the great hostelry. Believe it or not, 1,500 teams drove up to Taft's Hotel that day, and over 1,000 game birds were consumed. Edward Rose Snow.
Summer residents were discovering that there was more to Winthrop than the beach area. The Vokes family of English comedians summered at Sunnyside, and in 1885 Thomas Edison visited the nearby neighborhood of Woodside Park. One of the town's centers of commerce was McGee's store, a bustling general store that stood for 2 generations at the intersection that is still known as McGee's Corner. The area now known as the Winthrop Highlands was then called the City Farm. It had long belonged to Boston and was once the property of Dean Winthrop. William B. Rice, who also owned the Cottage Hill section, bought the City Farm in 1883. The land, which previously was used primarily for the hunting of waterfowl, was divided into house lots and streets. The foundation of modern Winthrop was complete. The year-round population grew.
The proportion of permanent residents to summer transients is rapidly increasing. People with heart for roughing and toughening experiences are learning that there is health even on the wings of winter gales when they come pure off the ocean, and a stimulus in the companionship of great breakers. Albert Winslow Cobb.
The first graduation day at Winthrop High School took place yesterday afternoon, when a goodly number of parents and citizens of Winthrop attended at the school to listen to the exercises of the children, who acquitted themselves in a very creditable manner and reflects great credit upon their master, Reverend L.O. Frost. The Beechmont and Winthrop Visitor, June 1882.
The tiny school inside the town hall had grown overcrowded, and a new 4-room grammar school was built at the site of the present E.B. Newton School.
When the building was finally erected in 1881, at a cost of less than $6,000, the selectmen referred to it as an ornament and credit to our town. McGuffey readers were among the textbooks used, and Worcester's New Pronouncing Spelling Book was the source for training local spellers for contests with grammar school representatives of Chelsea and Revere. Benjamin A. Little, The History of Winthrop.
A new high school followed in 1896. Winthrop, although home to a religious population, had only one church until the 1870s, the First Methodist Church built in 1834. The Union Congregational Church, St. John the Evangelist Catholic Church, the First Baptist Church, and St. John's Episcopal Church were all built between 1872 and 1890, and they all grew in size and influence. The Winthrop Yacht Club was founded in 1884.
Within 5 years, a pretty summer village has grown up around Great Head, and a planked walk projects into Crystal Bay for the convenience of the mariners of the Winthrop Yacht Club. This new construction is securely enrailed, and it is the Brighton Pier of this quiet resort, where the transient citizens may loaf and invite their souls, and feel the sea all around and beneath them, without fear of mal de mer. M.F. Sweetser.
At the Yacht Club's original clubhouse, boats could not leave the landing except at high tide. The clubhouse was moved down the street to a more advantageous location in 1890. In December of 1903, the building was destroyed by fire. Less than a year later, a new clubhouse was completed, dedicated on the 4th of July. The clubhouse still stands, and the Winthrop Yacht Club is today the oldest of 3 surviving yacht clubs in the town. In 1884, Dr. Samuel Ingalls, the mastermind of Ocean Spray, volunteer surgeon in the Civil War, former Winthrop selectman and school committeeman, was killed by a train at Ocean Spray. Ingalls was 66. He had lived long enough to see his vision of Ocean Spray become a spectacular reality.
To him belong the laurels of being the hero of Ocean Spray. And had he been ambitious of earthly immortality, he would doubtless have called it Inglesby by the Sea. Beechmont and Winthrop Visitor, 1883.
The death of Samuel Ingalls marked the end of a period of youthful exuberance for the town, which was now approaching adulthood. By 1890, Winthrop had 2 volunteer fire companies, a police department, a sewer system, and a public library. There were 208 students in the schools. Winthrop's 2 military installations, Fort Banks and Fort Heath, were built in the 1890s, prior to the Spanish-American War. The road from Winthrop to the Beechmont section of Revere was improved about 1900, giving the town 2 reliable access roads. A gradual transition was taking place as more and more families settled in Winthrop year-round, finding the town attractive and the transportation to Boston convenient. Between 1875 and 1890, the year-round population increased from about 600 to 2,726. After the Great Chelsea Fire of 1908, many people burned out of their homes, moved to Winthrop Beach, and by 1910 the population was over 10,000. Many of the emigrants from Chelsea were Jewish, and some of them founded the temple Tifereth Israel. The rest of the town filled in, creating the present 8 neighborhoods. Pointe Shirley was the last neighborhood to become populated year-round. But the popularity of Winthrop as a summer resort continued well past the turn of the century. A 1904 Cottage Park Hotel brochure boasted,
"While there is practically unlimited scope for the location of inland towns, Winthrop stands alone as the only seaside resort within easy reach of Boston, which is really desirable for either summer or permanent residence."
The completion of Winthrop Shore Drive, then called Crest Avenue, as a residential street around 1900, guaranteed that Winthrop would not be the site of an amusement park like nearby Revere Beach. Winthrop was number 15 in wealth per capita of all Massachusetts communities in 1904. Winthrop had reached maturity and had achieved an ideal balance between resort and residential town. The town's modern physical appearance continued to take shape. The familiar water tower on Great Head was erected in 1909.
Whatever color it is painted, as long as it stands, it will be the one landmark clearly identifying Winthrop, and one that can be seen from any point on the horizon. To those of us who grew up seeing it stand tall above the town, seemingly as sturdy as the hill on which it stands, it simply indicates home. W.E. Merriman.
In May of 1912, a Winthrop landmark, the Gibbons Elm, believed to have been about 300 years old, was considered a hazard and was cut down.
Many of the mourners came on the narrow gauge and used the Thornton station. Not one of the passengers could have known that the railroad itself was also doomed to extinction. When the Gibbons Elm came down, Winthrop passed from childhood into maturity. William H. Clark.
The whistle of the narrow-gauge train stopping at one of its 9 stations, the welcoming voices of those who have come down to see it come in, and the sigh of relief with which businessmen, weary from their day in the steaming city, step off and whiff the clean ocean air, remind us that we are in a very modern suburb. The automobiles chug off. The train pulls out. The last straggler directs his steps toward home, thinking gratefully of his saltwater dip before supper. Agnes Edwards Rothery, The Romantic Shore, 1915.
1,100 citizens of Winthrop served in the First World War. The town continued to prosper after the war. While the summer scene was not quite what it was 30 years earlier, it still flourished.
All summer long, this section was alive with great activity. Being close to Boston, it was a favorite spot for weekenders and vacationers. Unlike neighboring Revere Beach, there were no amusements or other commercial distractions to mar the natural orderliness of the place. There was little to do for those not interested in boating, fishing, or swimming, but many visitors were content to stroll along Shore Drive, relax on porch rockers, or lie on the beach in the ocean breeze and watch the rolling waves, passing sailboats, and the flight of white seagulls.
Winthrop, like all of America, was in love with the movies in the 20s.
The Winthrop Theater at the center and the Dream at the beach, later called the State, were palaces to us. If we could rustle up a dime for a Saturday matinee, we could watch Tom Mix or Hoot Gibson charge across the silver screen in pursuit of the bad guys, all to thunderous pounding on the theater's piano.
The building of the seawall and the breakwaters along the beach in Great Head combined to give Winthrop Beach its present physical character. The seawall was less picturesque than the railing it replaced, but it was a necessary evil. The sea, usually a friend of Winthropites, has been on occasion a ferocious enemy. Storms have caused great damage many times, but also serve as a form of entertainment.
It is entirely likely that the roaring surf, charging in like a stampede of wild horses from the sea, has always been Winthrop's off-season reason for being, at least as far as many people were concerned. Young and old alike came to the waterfront as the breakers crashed into the wall along the boulevard from the Highlands to Great Head, driving sheets of water and spray 30 or 40 feet in the air.
As Winthrop made the transition from resort to residential town, a shift in its population took place.
There was much to recommend the town in the first 20 years of the century, but the automobile was a new challenge, and the social elite began to seek more exclusive settings and a wider range of activities. Quiet little Winthrop was becoming too confining for them, and by the time of the Depression arrived, the butterflies had flown.
The 1920s brought other changes.
Once so impossibly distant from the city by land, Winthrop in the 1920s began to wonder if it was rather too close by sea. A rival peninsula, called by its creators the Boston Municipal Airport, crept out from East Boston into the harbor, drying up the waters that had always laved the southwesterly on its way to cool the brow of Pointe. The ever-lengthening runways came within 250 yards of that shore where Judge Loring had planted his summer cottage and George Emerson his trees. Belle Isle Inlet and its flats were partially filled for the Suffolk Downs racetrack and the million-gallon silos of that wry euphemism, the oil farm. The debris from all this filling ruined Winthrop's salt marshes and shoaled its harbor and the channel of Shirley Gut. Not that it mattered. The excursion steamers were long gone, and during World War II, the Army built a causeway across to Deer Island, where Boston maintained its House of Correction. Off the penal island, the Metropolitan District Commission dumped the combined sewage of 41 communities. The vapors peeled the paint from Winthrop's cottages, the fumes of oxidized kerosene from the jet aircraft screaming over the rooftops drifted down on Boston's first resort. Joseph Garland.
The narrow gauge railroad, electrified in 1928, struggled financially through the Depression and was shut down in 1940. It was replaced by a bus line.
Most of us still remember that final train which circled the town late Saturday night, January 27, 1940. The trip took well over an hour as gangs of young men, and some women too, blocked the tracks at each station, and the train was put into motion only with great difficulty. Probably there had never been so much patronage as on that train. It was literally jammed with people who wanted to say they had ridden on the final train. Never again did the whistles of trains echo in Winthrop. Never again were the crossing gates raised and lowered at the 4 crossings. The road was finished. William H. Clark.
Most of Winthrop's hotels and summer cottages were either torn down or destroyed by fire. Of the hotels, only 2 remain: the Winthrop Arms in the Highlands, and the Colonial Inn, now the Governor Winthrop Motel at the foot of Cottage Hill.
The need for large hotels in Winthrop had passed by the 1930s. A few pup tents would have sufficed in that dull decade.
Today's Winthrop is not without the problems of older towns. But Logan Airport and the sewage treatment plants at Deer Island have brought jobs, along with noise and pollution. The population is almost exclusively year-round, and the town remains unusually compact and close-knit. The Dean Winthrop House still stands, thanks to the efforts of the Winthrop Improvement and Historical Association. Waves still crash against the seawall, sending seawater cascading down the side streets in storms. People still fish from the bridge to Orient Heights. They still bask in the sun and the summer breezes along the beach and by the Yacht Club. And they will, as long as there are people in Winthrop, for the town's physical location is its prime reason for being. Winthrop's past is contained in its present.
It was a grand period to be a part of, almost as though gold or oil had been discovered in town. Perhaps it had been, in a way. However grand Winthrop was in its summer heyday, it did not afterward become in any sense a ghost town, haunted by its past. Nothing on this earth remains the same forever. The very rocks along Winthrop Beach are continually altering in size and shape, however imperceptibly. W.E. Merriman.